you're hiking through the Blue Ridge Mountains when you see an animal in the distance. Slowly, it changes shape into an entirely different creature. What would you do in that situation? Well, that is the plot of one of today's allegedly true stories. And there are 4 more stories to go along with it, featuring demons who want to take your children, black dog beasts, and fearsome flying monsters. Enjoy. Go to darkstories.org to send us your stories to narrate. Check out eeriecast.com to catch up on all our podcasts. Now, let's begin. Shapeshifter in the Mountains. From Anonymous. This crazy event took place in the Blue Ridge Mountain region of South Carolina at a fairly popular but very secluded campground right off of the Chautauqua River. It all started when my mom and dad, along with their best friends, another married couple, Stacy and Stephen, decided to go spend the day on the river. To get to the river, you drive through a town a ways up the mountain and eventually go down a road that turns to gravel for a couple of miles, with a parking lot at the end. Then you walk along a trail from the lot about a half-mile to the river. There's a big rock everyone always chills on in the river, and that's where they decided to go for the day. Well, Stacy ends up getting trashed drunk from a cooler of beer she brought. She was a pretty big woman and liked to drink. She ends up jumping in the river and floating out of sight. It's about midday at this point, so my mom and dad and Stephen go looking for her. It takes them hours, but they end up finding her down the river assaulting some girl at a campsite in a drunken stupor. My mom gets her off of the girl and apologizes. The campers are chill and let them go. By this point, it's getting dark fast. Now, I don't know how they got separated, but they did. Stephen more or less had to drag Stacy back to the car at the lot, and my parents got left behind and were separated when it got dark. By some miracle, my dad crawled back to the gravel road through the forest and ran back into Stephen and Stacy, but my mom was left behind in the pitch-black mountain forest. My dad yelled out for her and searched for a long time before he just started crawling out, and he never found her. It's the middle of the night by then, and they know they couldn't find her in that kind of darkness, so they all came back to the house. Yeah, my mom got left miles in a forest in the parkway all night all alone. But as soon as we knew day would be breaking soon, we left the house to go looking. It was me, my dad, Stephen, and my good friend at the time, who happened to live with us. We'll call him Alex. We were heading up there in Stephen's Isuzu Trooper. Stephen was driving. Dad was in the front passenger seat. I was behind Dad in the back seat, and Alex was beside me. We made it to the gravel road leading to the lot, and the sun was peeking in the trees now. We were on a good straightaway. Suddenly, we see something ahead on the side of the road shuffling around. It looks like a small possum-like creature, maybe the size of a basketball. It has off-white fur, and it was kind of shaggy. We all had our windows down at the time. It was summer and it was pretty warm after all. Our little group was speculating on what it could be, but we assumed it was just some little forest critter. Nothing too striking, so we didn't think much of it. We were going maybe 15 miles per hour, and we came up to it about 20 yards away, and I'm looking right at it at this point as we approach. The next thing I know, right before my freaking eyes, this little ball of fur just kind of jumps and spins and morphs right before us into this fairly large anomaly of a creature. It was maybe 3.5 feet tall and hunched with large padded feet and legs, similar to a kangaroo, and a long hairless tail like a giant rat. Its body was fairly stocky with thin arms held tightly to its chest. But I could see little black hands with claws. And yes, I mean hands, not paws or anything like that. Not quite human, but hands with opposable appendages. Now the head was the freakiest. It was like a greyhound dog head, with lots of tiny pearly teeth, and a thin snout, but all its skin was black and its body had thick black matted fur. Yet the head had neatly kept dreadlocks bouncing off the top of its head between pointed ears and nearly hairless face. But like I said before, it was similar to a greyhound dog head in shape and size. This was the most bizarre thing I'd ever seen. I can't even explain how it made me feel, not evil, but supernatural, definitely intelligent. The whole scene was just surreal. It looked at all of us as it matched our speed. We all freaked out and gawked at it as it hopped beside the car. Oh yeah, it was definitely hopping, extremely fast. Steven sped up to about 50 miles per hour, but it just stayed beside us, seemingly effortlessly. It was on mine and my dad's side. I got a good look at it. Its eyes were like red beads, but glowing like an LED light in the day. It appeared to smile, showing teeth a little from its greasy snout. After maybe 15 to 20 seconds, it bounded in front of the car and disappeared into the forest, like a freaking kangaroo rat dog, whatever the heck it was. It was absolutely wild. After that, we were all in shock and awe, and far more eager to find my mom. Steven and Dad were tripping out by then. I was just like, holy crap, I couldn't believe what we saw. And Alex never said anything. He just had wide, confused eyes. Well, we found my mom later and all was well. She had hunkered down in a stump hole overnight, with a shirt over her head. She was teed off for being left, understandably so. So yeah, me and 3 other perfectly sane men saw a small furry possum-like creature jump and morph into a monstrosity of a beast right before our eyes. And now, I believe in shapeshifters. To put the icing on the cake, I saw the darn thing a couple of weeks later right up the road from my house. My sister was with me in the car that night. She freaked out and told everyone else we'd told the story to that it was indeed real. I live almost an hour from the mountain spot where we first saw it, and it was in the large hoppy rat thing form when it bounced beside me on my way home that night 2 weeks later. My sister was petrified and says she will never forget that and how it looked. She described it identically to how I saw it. So I guess it followed us home. Maybe. I don't know. But it freaks me the heck out. That's my story. Believe it or not, it's true. We don't know what all is hiding out there in the world. But whatever that was, me and 4 other people have now witnessed it. Be safe, especially out in the mountains and the wilderness. Thankfully, the thing wasn't aggressive so far, but it certainly looked like it could do some damage if it wanted to. Take heed to the unknown. Home Alone with a Skinwalker. From Xin. I live in a small suburb on the outskirts of a rather large city in Texas. For most of my life, I've lived in the same house. It's a tiny 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house, almost cottage-esque. We had a big backyard, maybe an acre, and overall our property was pretty nice. Ever since I can remember, I've been more aware of otherworldly things than my family. I think most of my experiences took place in this house. Sure, my parents would have something odd happen here and there, but nothing too out of the ordinary. Before I start my story, I want to point out, I don't think there's only one supernatural being or entity that takes residence on my property. There have been multiple incidents that don't match up with each other at all. I've always considered the house to be an Airbnb for the paranormal, if that makes sense. One day, when I was 13 years old, I had my best friend, Moss, over. They had already been at my house for a couple of days, and my parents trusted us both completely. So they left to go have dinner together after ordering us some food and making sure we were fed. About 45 minutes after they left, we were watching a horror movie in the living room, sitting next to each other on the couch, when we heard the doorbell ring. As it was already tense in the room due to the scary movie, we both jumped. Then we laughed at each other for jumping at the mere sound of the doorbell. I got up, and I checked the window first, but I didn't see anyone there, so I shrugged it off. Sometimes it did go off for no reason. It wasn't that out of the ordinary. But I did get a little concerned when it kept happening every 5 minutes or so. I was getting really annoyed, and so was Moss. I went outside on the porch and looked around my yard, then out to the street. The dim light of the street lamps just barely illuminated the road. After again seeing no one, I grumbled in frustration, then went back inside. The doorbell didn't ring after that. An hour later, we were both lying together about to fall asleep. My friend had already delved deep into slumber, and I was about to follow them right into it, but something caught my eye. Slight movement outside the window. The curtain was covering most of it, but a little sliver of the glass was showing, and there was definitely something moving around out there. To clarify, this window is facing the backyard. I got up, careful not to wake Moss, and crept over to the window as quietly as I could. I peeked through it and got a closer look at what was disturbing the peace of my yard. It looked human, but the proportions seemed a bit off. It was hunched over, almost on all fours, ripping out the grass and dandelions, shoving them into its mouth. Mind you, I could not see its mouth. It was much too dark for that. That's when I got the brilliant idea to turn on the back light. Bright yellow flooded my backyard. The thing stood up straight as a board. I heard it making quiet murmuring noises, and then louder yelling, then a deafening screech. It sounded like a mixture of a yelping dog, an owl, and a human screaming bloody murder. Disturbing to say the least. It turned to face the window where I was standing. The curtain opened more than halfway, so I'm sure it could see me. I got a good look at it then, especially when it began to press its entire body against the window. Its skin was ashy gray and wrinkly and stretched too tight around its skinny bones. Each eye took up no more than an inch of its face, and there were vacuous holes. Out of all of the horrible features this thing possessed, I think its mouth was the worst. Instead of a human-like mouth that opened and closed, it was a perfect circle, lined with razor-sharp teeth that were stained red and brown, almost like the mouth of a leech. Like its eyes, it was pitch dark inside the mouth and seemed to have no visible end. Like if you fell in, you'd be falling for eternity. Moss ran into the room, hearing its inhuman scream, then let out a scream of their own. I think that just set it off more, because it began slamming its body into the window, causing spiderweb-like cracks to appear. I grabbed Moss's arm and ran into my parents' room, as it was the only one with a lock. Once we got in there and pushed the dresser against the door, we heard the glass shatter, followed by rampant banging footsteps from inside the house. We were both dead silent, except for our heavy pants. All at once, everything stopped. The footsteps and the screeching. Instead, we heard a disturbing clicking sound coming closer and closer to the door. We hid in the closet, covering our mouths and hugging each other tight. We both thought we were going to die soon. The clicking receded from the door, though. Moments later, the front door opened and my mother's voice rang out throughout the house. All my fear and instincts fled me, and I ran out of the closet, moss in hand, dragging my parents outside the house, shushing their scolds. The creature was still inside, and it had heard us. It ran towards the front and slammed through the front door. My mom yelled in terror, and my stepmom pushed all of us behind her. For the second time that night, I thought for sure I was going to die, but no, the thing just kept running. Across my yard, across the street, into the trees. None of us spoke much that night. I think we were all scared and confused and traumatized all at the same time. I don't know what it was we saw. I don't want to know. But what I do know is that I'll never want to have an encounter with that again, because I know that I won't survive a second one. Thunderbird Encounter in the Rocky Mountains, from James M.W. I was born and lived most of my life in Ohio, but moved to Colorado at 12. I should say that I do believe in the supernatural and paranormal. I currently live with my mother and stepfather, and the house my father owns has the ghost of one of his friends in it, we believe. He passed away in the home around 5 years ago. Well, 7 years ago, my family and I were homeless, and we were staying in a broke-down RV on land in the Rocky Mountains that belongs to a family friend. Now, being that I was 13 at the time and in love with nature, I went out into the woods and rock faces behind the RV all the time, and I loved to find different animals that I've never seen before. I found different lizards and even almost became dinner for a bobcat once. But that was nothing compared to what I bumped into a few weeks later. Now, I'm not full-blood native. I only have a little bit in me. However, through my years of research, I'm 19 now, there's only one being that it could have been that I saw, and I'm not sure if it was good or bad. I just can't find out exactly on the internet what it truly means to encounter a Thunderbird. Anyway, it happened a few weeks after I had a brush with a bobcat. I was exploring the land my family and I lived on. I found an old wood building in the forest with some old tools on the broken down floor. Now, this was one of the few times that I went off exploring without my older brother, so I knew I was the only one out there at the time in those woods. That day, I didn't hear any animal noises at all. No birds, no bugs, nothing. The hunters out there listening or reading, you might say that this means that there's a wolf, bobcat, or bear around, but this was different. It was beyond the normal silence. Now that I think of it, I remember hearing small animals in the old building when I first went in. Bugs, rats, a few snakes even. But then they all just stopped, for seemingly no reason whatsoever. It was around 11 a.m., so the sun was bright in the sky. I've got good eyes, so I would have known if it was a normal animal I saw when I opened the door to this old building. Somehow sitting in a tree about 20 feet away from me, staring down at me for about 10 to 15 seconds, was a giant bird. At 13, I was 5'11", so I wasn't a small kid. This bird was twice my size easily, with a wingspan that was well over 13 feet if not much bigger. The animal itself was jet black, no other color at all, as if it were a shadow or something. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring up at this being, and as it looked at me dead in the eyes, all I could do was just stand there. I didn't feel fear or dread or anything like that. It was more that I didn't want to move. I didn't understand what I was seeing. Now, in case of emergencies, I did always carry a large 13-inch Bowie knife on my hip. But I know that if this thing wanted to, there would be nothing I could do to stop it from killing me right then and right there. And by the time I realized what it might have been, it just opened its wings and flew away. All these years later, I now work at a factory, and during the night shift, sometimes I'll see a shadow of a large bird much bigger than me. The current largest living bird in the world, Diomedea excellens, or wandering albatross. It has a wingspan of 12 feet, but this is an island bird, and it's white, so I know it wasn't a known animal or whatever wording you'd use. This was something rare, something beyond belief. To this day, I'm not sure what it actually was, but the only thing I can think of is Thunderbird. Now, believe what you want and say what you'd like, but this did actually happen. Black Dog Thing, from TC the Annoyed. Before I get into the story itself, I need to provide you with some background info. I'm a Native American, and in my culture we have many myths, legends, and folklore. One example of folklore in my culture is the Skinwalker. For those that don't know, a Skinwalker can take the form of various creatures. However, they will always be slightly different, like a cat with dog fur, or a dog with cat's ears and human eyes. I've been told stories passed down for generations. As I begin telling you my story, this is on a first-hand account, and everything that's being said is true. Now with that out of the way, let's get started. When I was younger, my little brother and I had noticed an owl was following us around. We had noticed that this owl was not a regular-sized owl. This one was roughly around 5 feet tall. We'd also noticed that it would linger around us and watch us. We considered this to be normal, and we never showed any form of fear or anything to that extent. My brother and I began to develop the belief that this owl was a form of a protector. Our mom had mentioned that the owl had arrived around the time we were born, and began to follow us everywhere we went. When we were younger, we lived on a farm. Anytime we'd be out on the land, the owl would be around us. Our mom had also told us about how the same owl would sit on the stop sign at the end of the road if we had gone somewhere. When we'd get closer to the house, the owl would follow the car back to our property. When we turned 13 years old, I noticed that the owl had stopped coming around the house or following us. And when I was 16, I ended up getting into a huge argument with my dad, and I stayed at my mom's house for a good while. One night I returned to my dad's house. It was my first time being at his house in months. As nighttime began to rise, I noticed the same owl was at the house. Around 3 a.m., I heard the owl outside. I went to check and I saw it. I waved to the owl and began walking to my grandpa's house. During this time, the bathroom in my parents' house was being worked on, so we had to go to my grandpa's to use the restroom. As I began walking towards my grandpa's house, the owl began to follow me towards his place. In between the houses, there's a good amount of land, roughly about the length of a football field. As I continued walking to my grandpa's house with my dog, I noticed that the owl was alarmed and began hooting frantically. I looked up at the owl to see where it was. Then I looked down to see if there was anything around the area, alarming it. As I did so, I heard movement in the brush in another field, the same field where the cows were located. I soon began to see this big black mass, roughly about 2 feet bigger than a Shetland pony. My dog had noticed it and began to growl and run. As I was walking towards the gate, I saw a normal-sized black dog that was not supposed to be there. The dog then began to run towards the stables, where my dog had run off to. After the dog ran away, I continued to walk towards my grandpa's house to use the bathroom. When I was finished, I had gone back outside, and I noticed my dog was standing on my grandpa's porch, visibly scared and shaking. I patted her to make sure she was okay and to calm her down. That's when I heard a noise behind my grandpa's truck, which was roughly 20 feet away from the porch. I pulled out my knife that I would use as a form of self-defense if I ever got attacked. I walked off the porch and approached the truck. As I did, I noticed a creature standing about 5 feet away from me. This animal looked somewhat like a dog, but it wasn't a dog. I then remembered that it was the same figure that I saw in the field earlier. After easing myself out of a stage of shock, it really hit me. I was only a few feet away from a medium horse-sized creature which was staring me down and growling, and all I had in my hand was a knife. One of the first things I noticed was its front paws, but they didn't look like normal paws. They were elongated and looked similar to fingers. They were more spread out than a dog's paw. I then noticed its head slowly began to come out of the darkness. I saw its eyes, some brown but also whiter around the eye. It starts to move closer to me. The legs were similar to a dog's legs. However, the creature's legs were more muscular, like a man's. I immediately reacted by throwing the knife at its paw. The creature moved its paw just fast enough to avoid being hit. I then hear the owl screech, and the dog looks at me. I'm closing the distance between me and the creature. It then looks up as the owl begins to fly above me and my dog. It was distracted. I took the opportunity to grab for my knife. I then make an attempt to attack the creature, but it jumps back, easily avoiding the knife, then turns and runs back into the field. I can hear the owl flying back towards the field, where the creature had run off to. Slowly and cautiously, I make my way back to my parents' house. As I approach the gate from the field and into the yard, I hear a yelp and a loud thud, followed by a screech. I look up and see the owl fly from the cow field towards a tree sitting in the yard of my dad's house. When the owl landed, it looked at me and started to hoot. It was like it was telling me everything was going to be okay, that I should go inside now. The following morning, I woke up and went out to the field where the creature had come from. I found a large patch of the brush that was flattened, but there was no blood, no carcass from the creature that had tried to attack me. I also noticed that the owl was not around the property. I'm 22 years old now, and I've not seen the owl or the creature since that night. My dad is still located on the same property that I grew up on, and I do visit the property frequently. After that night, I don't know what happened to the owl or that beast, but one thing I do know is that I believe I encountered a Skinwalker. I also believe that the owl was there to protect me one last time. I don't know what to think about this story, and I've never shared it because I never thought anyone would actually listen to it or believe me. So what better place to tell it than here? My Demonic Encounter, from JustineMc. I'm a happily married 28-year-old female. I've been with my husband since August of 2012, after I graduated high school. That summer, prior to meeting him, I was dabbling into some pretty dark stuff. I was studying witchcraft, reading tarot cards, and playing with Ouija boards. I even tried to cast a few spells. I'm no longer into all that. In all honesty, I'm a Christian now, but the consequences of my actions back then may have ended up sticking around for quite some time. Of course, being 19 at the time, I was a little stupid, because I knew better. But curiosity killed the cat, so to speak. I got pretty good at being a witch, so I decided the tell-all would be casting a spell. I'm not going to go into detail of what the spell was for personal reasons, but I think it worked. It was actually a little overwhelming how well it worked. But like everything in dealing with magic, there are karma effects after time. The results started off perfectly, just the way I wanted. But it ended up very bad. It backfired severely, and I was so upset that I was planning on trying it again. But that's when the paranormal disturbances began. It started off very minor and cliché. Knocks on the walls, footsteps in the middle of the night when no one was awake, and nightmares. Eventually, it happened so frequently, I managed to ignore it over time. Fast forward about 2 years later, when it began to take a turn for the worst. I am and have been with my boyfriend for those 2 years. We weren't married yet. We fell on a lot of hard times financially in the beginning, so for those reasons, we were still living at my parents' house, which was where I performed all my witchcraft spells and Ouija board uses. The first paranormal instance I can recall is a demonically induced nightmare. It was absolutely terrifying and way too realistic. I dreamt I was in my bedroom. Everything was the same. Nothing was off except a couple of things. In real life, we sleep in total pitch black darkness, but when the dream began, there was a light. It looked artificial, and it seemed to be coming from my vanity mirror, not in the actual room. I found myself sitting on my bedroom floor with my legs crossed and my boyfriend sitting on the edge of the bed. In the dream, we didn't speak to each other for what felt like an hour. It was just us sitting in the said positions when all of a sudden, my boyfriend asked me what was wrong with my face. I got up from the floor and looked in the mirror. The light was coming from the mirror, making it hard to see in it at first, but when my eyes adjusted to my reflection, I noticed my face began to change. It went from my own face slowly turning into a demonic Reagan McNeil exorcist-looking face. I then lost all sense of control of my own body and my sense of self. Before I knew it, my body turned around and looked at my boyfriend, and I began to maniacally laugh. It was a dark, deep, bone-chilling, demonic laugh, and I began to levitate upright around the room, pointing and laughing at my boyfriend who sat there in pure fear. Then I woke up. When I was awake, I was covered in sweat, and before you ask, it was 3:30 a.m., right on the nose, when I checked the time. That was, to this day, the scariest nightmare I ever had. The next disturbance occurred not too long after that. I would say about 6 or so months later, if I had to guess. My boyfriend and I had finally gotten on our feet. We got a car and we headed to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we stayed with some friends. We both ended up getting really good jobs. He was a collision technician at a popular body shop, and I got a job as a barista at Starbucks. While we were working and saving money, our schedules were all different. Our roommate, Kevin, worked at a nursing home, so sometimes he slept all day and worked at night, or vice versa. Cody, my boyfriend, worked a consistent 8 to 4 Monday through Friday, and my schedule was super inconsistent. Typically, I worked 8 to 4 or 9 to 5, but my days off didn't coincide with anyone else's. I tried to get as many weekends off as I could, but it wasn't always possible. I would sometimes have to work on a Saturday or a Sunday and have a random weekday off. The Starbucks I worked at was a little short-staffed, so I did a lot of overtime. One time in particular, on a Thursday specifically, I had the day off. I was home alone. My boyfriend Cody and my roommate Kevin were both at work. I was the only female living with 2 guys, so needless to say I had a lot of cleaning to do. I spent most of my day cleaning and tidying up, and it was around 1 p.m. when I finished. I decided since there wasn't much else to do, I was going to take a nap. That was when I experienced my first episode of sleep paralysis. I lay there. I don't recall dreaming at all. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I lay there and heard the front door of our apartment open and close. I heard footsteps stomp on the welcome rug. It sounded like Cody was home. The sound resembled his work boots. It had to be him, I thought, because I always keep the apartment door locked, and he and Kevin were the only ones with keys. And I knew it wasn't Kevin. I kept listening as I lay there, and I heard the footsteps come closer from the kitchen, through the living room, and coming straight to the bedroom where I was napping. I tried to wake myself up so I could greet him, but I found myself unable to move or even open my eyes. I heard the bedroom door open and close, and I felt someone sit at the edge of the bed. I felt the indentation. Then I suddenly felt like someone was grabbing my throat. I felt the pressure, and I was having trouble breathing. I freaked out, but I couldn't move, scream, or speak, so I began to pray in my head, and slowly but surely, the entity loosened its grip. I was finally able to get up. I still felt the remnants of pressure on my throat. I was absolutely terrified. I looked over at the digital clock, and it was only 2:40 p.m. I'd only been asleep for about an hour and a half, and Cody didn't get home until almost 5. When I put together all the pieces of information in my head and realized how real that was, and wasn't a dream, that I was still home alone, I totally panicked. I didn't want to be home alone anymore. I didn't have the car, so I couldn't leave. I immediately called Cody at work in tears, begging him to come home early. He said he would try his best, but he was in the middle of a big job and had to finish up what he was doing before he could even think about leaving. When you do body work on a car, you can't just walk away in the middle of wet sanding. So I had to sit there, alone, and just wait. I sat in the kitchen by the door until he actually called and said he was on his way. It was 4 p.m., so he obviously wasn't able to leave as early as I wanted him to. When he got home, he found me on the kitchen floor crying. I told him what happened, and he comforted me and told me I was going to be okay. He believed me, which was a relief, being he had a few paranormal experiences as a kid. He said if it ever happened again when I'm home alone, to just pray. So from that point on, that's exactly what I did. Hence how I became a Christian in the first place. I never attended a church or anything, because I'm not big on organized religion. I'm more like an independent Bible scholar, to put it simply. Praying helped, but there came to be a point in time where it wasn't enough. The next experience was one of the worst of all. By then, it was early 2017. Cody and I were married, and I found out I was pregnant with our son. It was early on in my pregnancy, first trimester, so I slept a lot. I didn't really get morning sickness much, but I did get these awful headaches at night, almost like migraines minus the nausea. They just made me sleep, because being pregnant, I wasn't allowed to take any over-the-counter medication for it. It was one of those evenings where I felt a headache coming on, so I decided to just go to bed. It was around 9 p.m. My husband lay next to me, reading news articles on his phone, because he wasn't ready to sleep yet. He can verify that this happened being 100% aware and awake. I had a nightmare about a demon trying to possess me. I couldn't see it physically. It was just like a shadow figure with goat horns. It was unnerving, and I didn't have the strength to fight it. It told me it wanted my baby. I fought as best I could. Then I remembered to pray, but it was too late. When I began to speak in my dream, I also spoke out loud in my sleep, and my husband heard it. Not only was it not in English, but it wasn't my voice either. In fact, it was a multitude of demonic voices speaking out of my mouth, according to him. Whatever these voices said, they freaked out Cody. And I heard it myself, apparently, because I woke up from it. My eyes shot open. I sat up terrified. I tried to tell Cody what happened, but I was crying so hard by then. Anything I said was pretty incoherent. When I finally calmed down, I explained to him that even though what we both heard come out of my mouth was utterly terrifying, the demon in my dream was worse, because it wanted our child. He was angry, and he said we needed to pray together, so we did. After that experience, I was nothing but paranoid throughout my entire pregnancy. I prayed all the time, and I was so worried that a demon was going to try and steal my baby or cause some type of miscarriage or something. It was awful. In the meantime, nothing else really happened until the night I went into labor. After numerous appointments and being told my due date was October 11th, it turned out he ended up coming later. My son was born on October 30th at 3 a.m. I'm not joking, not by any means. He was healthy, however, and the delivery went well. Everything was intact, but his birthday was troubling to me and still is, especially after having that dream. Fast forward to the summer of 2021, my son is going to be 4 years old this year. When he was 2, we left Pittsburgh and moved back to Ohio, and we stayed with my parents. We worked until the Rona hit. We both ended up losing our jobs and applied for temporary unemployment to get the money together for an apartment in the next town over for my parents. We're renting a pretty nice apartment now. We moved in September of 2020 and we've been there ever since. When we got here, my son started hearing things coming from my bedroom closet. He sleeps with us. He started talking about noise. He said he saw noise poking his head out from the closet at night, and he was really scary. Being that he's only currently 3, he can only be so descriptive. He just said that he lives in mommy and daddy's closets and has a weird head and that he's scary. Mind you, considering his age, since he makes noises, my son calls him Noise, just for future reference. One night I was scrolling through YouTube. My son was on my lap. I stumbled across a video by Mr. Creeps with the thumbnail photo being a goat-like demon head. My son pointed at my phone and yelled to me, "Look, Mommy, it's Noise." My heart sank straight to my stomach, and I immediately started asking him questions. I made him reassure me if that's what noise looked like, and he said yeah, and proceeded to pry with questions like, "Does he talk to you? And if so, what does he say?" My son just replied he only talks to him in his bad dreams, but he didn't know what he said. I found this utterly alarming, to say the least. The next day, I called my uncle, who was a pastor of a church not too far away from us. I asked him to come over and bless our home after I came clean and told him the whole story that I just told you, leading up to my son seeing this entity. He said he would stop by, but he's also a truck driver on the side, so he'd only be able to do it on his next day off, which wouldn't be until 8 or so days later. As I impatiently waited for his day off, life remained the same. My son didn't really mention noise much at all, and we were doing a lot of praying. One day, about 4 or 5 days later, Cody, my son, and myself were upstairs in our spare bedroom that we turned into a video game lounge. We call it the Chill Cave. We were playing Left 4 Dead 2 on the mini couch, and our son had his Minecraft toys he was playing with on the floor. We were so focused on the game that we didn't realize our son had gotten up and left the room. I thought maybe he was going to go pee since we potty trained him early. But the next thing we knew, we heard a super loud tumble. My heart was racing so fast, I knew the moment it happened it was my worst fear. My son had fallen down the stairs. My husband and I didn't think twice. We ran out of the room and down the stairs, where my son sat at the bottom landing crying hysterically. We made sure he was okay, checking him out, and miraculously enough, literally, he wasn't hurt, other than a big bruise on his elbow and knee. He didn't hit his head, nor did he break a bone. Thank God. When we finally got him to calm down, and we put some ice on his elbow and knee, we set him down and asked him what happened, wondering if he tripped on something or slipped on the rug. To my surprise and fear, he said, "No. Noise was hiding in the bathroom. I tried to run away and hide from him, and he pushed me down the steps." I was so full of emotion, fear, anger, just plain dismay. I had officially had enough. So I did some research on how to properly bless your home without the sage, or going all out with objects of the church or religion and relying on God alone, and that's what we did. We walked around our home, praying and asking Jesus Christ to remove all wicked spirits from our home. We opened our front door and forced them to use it as an exit. We haven't had anything else happen since that day. If anything else does happen, I'll be sure to keep you updated. Until then, any advice or prayers would be greatly appreciated, so this demon doesn't return into our lives.